And then, is the White House concerned that Major League Baseball is moving their All-Star game to Colorado, where voting regulations are very similar to Georgia?
Well, let me just refute the first point you made. First, let me say on Colorado, Colorado allows you to register on Election Day. Colorado has voting by mail, where they send to 100% of people in the state who are eligible applications to vote by mail. 94% of people in Colorado voted by mail in the 2020 election. And they also allow for a range of materials to provide, even if they vote on Election Day, for the limited number of people who vote on Election Day. I think it's important to remember the context here. The Georgia legislation is built on a lie. There was no widespread fraud in the 2020 election. Georgia's top Republican election officials have acknowledged that repeatedly in interviews. And what there was, however, was record-setting turnout, especially by voters of color. So instead, what we're seeing here is for politicians who didn't like the outcome, they're not changing their policies to win more votes. They're changing the rules to exclude more voters. And we certainly see the circumstances as different. But ultimately, let me add one more thing. It's up to Major League Baseball to determine where they're holding their All-Star game.
It looks like Republicans have found their make-believe scandal of the day, wherein they're pretending to be outraged over the MLB's decision to move the All-Star game out of Georgia and into Colorado over Georgia Republicans' decision to restrict voter access. Only, per usual, it doesn't even come close to passing the smell test. So let's discuss the differences between Colorado and Georgia, since Republicans have decided that pretending Colorado is more restrictive than Georgia is the hill that they're going to die on. First of all, Colorado automatically sends all voters a mail ballot. In Georgia, forget about all voters automatically getting a ballot in the mail. You can't even get a ballot application mailed to you unless you specifically request it. In Colorado, you can register to vote even on Election Day. In Georgia, you can't. In Colorado, there are 368 drop boxes statewide, and they're available 24 hours a day. In Georgia, the number of drop boxes in each county is limited to only one per early voting site, or one for every 100,000 voters in the county, whichever number is smaller. And the drop boxes all have to be located either in a county election office or at an early voting precinct location, and they have to be indoors, which makes them even less accessible. But amid all of this, let's remember the most important fact here. 99% of Coloradans vote by mail. 99%. So we can get into the minutia of different provisions that really don't impact that many people, but at the end of the day, effectively all Coloradans are able to take advantage of the easiest voting option. Now, some critics are pointing to the fact that there's voter ID for in-person voting in Colorado, but here's the thing. It doesn't matter if almost no one votes in person. You can make it so that you have to do a double handspring to vote in person, but if no one uses that method, then those limits don't really matter, do they? And I'm obviously being facetious, but just to be clear, for those who do vote in person in Colorado, they use what's called a non-strict voter ID law, meaning you can use a wide range of different types of ID, including those without photos. And even if you have no ID, you can still vote with a provisional ballot. But in Georgia, there's a strict ID law, meaning that you need photo ID. And even if you cast a provisional ballot, you still need to produce a photo ID to a county registrar within 3 days. Another claim by critics is that Georgia offers 17 days of early voting, while Colorado only offers 15. Here's Harris Faulkner airing that exact claim on Fox News.
Sometimes we can't tell the future. But Joe, from what you're saying, Atlanta, all of Georgia can be hurt by these decisions. And I want to point out, who did their homework on Denver? Who did their homework on Colorado? Compare the voter laws. Is there ID required in Colorado like Georgia? Yes. To vote in person. Sometimes you have to bring a picture ID if it's your first time. And in Colorado, 15 days of early voting. That's less than the early days of voting, fewer than they have in Georgia, 17 to 19 there.
Yeah, Harris, I don't think many of these companies really, truly studied the bill or saw the fact checks that were done on them. And I think, honestly, they're just responding to this woke mob on Twitter that kind of really doesn't exist. They sound loud and they scream about boycotts. But in the end, if you stand your ground in these situations and say, look, we're not going to get involved here politically. In Atlanta, for instance, with Major League Baseball, we're going to honor the great Hank Aaron.
But again, given the fact that nearly all voters vote by mail in Colorado, you simply don't need as many days to vote early there. Those early voting sites are for the 1% of Coloradans who vote in person. Remember, the lines we saw in the last election were as long as 11 hours in Georgia. That's what voters contend with even during early voting in that state. That same problem doesn't exist in Colorado, unless there's a 2-minute line to drop your ballot in a drop box. 2 more days of early voting in a state with already long lines and onerous restrictions doesn't mean that Georgia is suddenly a beacon of accessibility. It means those critics cherry-picked one factoid without any regard for the context surrounding it, like why Colorado might not even need as many days of early voting. The fact is, Colorado has the second highest voter turnout in the entire country. More than 3/4 of all registered voters in Colorado cast a ballot, and that's facilitated by practices and laws that make it easier to vote, not more difficult. And that's the difference here, because the intent in Georgia is to restrict access to the polls, while states like Colorado seek to make voting more accessible. Republicans like to make these comparisons as if they're happening in a vacuum, but context matters here. It's not like Democrats won in Colorado, and so they made it more difficult to cast ballots as a result of that. Colorado has been expanding access for years, but in Georgia, that is exactly what happened. The people of Georgia showed up in record numbers and Democrats won, and so as a result, Republicans limited access and imposed more barriers and eliminated voting options. The intent was to make it more difficult to vote. They're heading in the wrong direction, and they're doing it with a very specific purpose in mind. And beyond the differences between Colorado and Georgia's voter access, let's not forget the most important part amid all of this. The MLB's decision to move the All-Star game was the direct result of Georgia's voter suppression. So I get that Republicans want to pretend to be mad and pretend that they're going to boycott baseball and pretend that Colorado and Georgia have the same restrictive laws, but if they want to take issue with anything, they should probably focus their attention on the root of the problem here, which is that Georgia Republicans tried to restrict voter access. Republicans are pretending like the real scandal here is that the MLB just up and decided to move the game, like it happened in a vacuum. It didn't. Republicans restricted voter access, the MLB responded. The issue here isn't the MLB's response, it is what they're responding to. The simple fact is that this is the free market at work. A free market, by the way, that Republicans have spent years falling over themselves to defend. Only now, suddenly it's government tyranny and the woke mob and cancel culture and whatever else they can point to, all because the free market suddenly isn't unilaterally benefiting them. If the MLB or Coca-Cola or Delta or any other company wants to speak out against voter suppression, if they want to move operations or take a stand or do anything they want, guess what? They can, because of that very free market that Republicans have hailed for as long as we can remember. So again, at some point we should probably be able to recognize that if the whole country and the whole business community are criticizing voter suppression, the answer isn't to call for a boycott against those companies, it's to, oh, I don't know, stop suppressing votes. And when they can finally manage to do that, then maybe they won't have to be on the defense from every company from Coca-Cola to America's pastime. To see more videos like this, don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel and click the notification bell. And please subscribe to my podcast, No Lie with Brian Tyler Cohen, where I not only break down the biggest stories of the week, but I also interview major players in the world of politics, including Vice President Kamala Harris, Elizabeth Warren, Nancy Pelosi, Katie Porter, Pete Buttigieg, Cory Booker, Jamie Raskin, and many more. Again, that's No Lie with Brian Tyler Cohen, available anywhere you listen to podcasts.